Okay, now let's start. First of all, a warm welcome to all of you to the second workshop of AI narratives. And this time we focus on China's science fictions, and together with the Cambridge team, we have months of arrangement and consideration. So my thanks to all the Cambridge teams and colleagues, and also my thanks to Xingyuan, our coordinator in the workshop, and also other colleagues who have been working very hard for this workshop. And also I want to thank our researcher Hoa Jingfang for her months of efforts. Without your effort and contribution, this workshop would not have been possible. And before we start, I want to review our themes and our original aspiration. So this is from the Cambridge idea and also in combination with our characteristics. So we have a series of workshops on AI narratives. We look at China's philosophies, culture, tradition, and social environment, and how to shape our understanding of technologies and also the higher order technologies, and also the species whose intelligence is beyond human beings, and also the more in-depth cultural and psychological structures, how they can intentionally and unintentionally influence our understanding of the future and our attitudes towards the super intelligence that might appear in the future. Maybe we are happy, or we are scared, or we don't care. So how such social psychological structures influence the development of such frontier technologies and the extent to which we accept the emergence of such ultra intelligence, and how our aspiration and how our projection into the future can reflect such social psychological structure. So this is the original purpose of our project. Last time we focused on the Chinese classics, including the folklore, culture, and religion, and also how they influence the social psychological structures and construct. And we have invited representatives from the Taoism and historians and philosophers from China, and you can review the highlights in our website. And this time, in this workshop, we'll focus on China's science fictions. And personally, I hope that in the following aspects, we can have some inspirations. And maybe I will focus on more broader issues. So 3 aspects. First, the questions posed by China's science fiction, anxiety, confusion, and the prospects. What are the characteristics? What are the origins or the sources of such emotions? What are the sources of inspiration for China's science fiction? And second, about the cultural foundation. What's the cultural foundation for China's science fiction? And maybe we can ask ourselves, are we living in this homogeneous culture, or are we being influenced by the technological culture? So as a result, the cultural differences will be bridged by the technologies. And thirdly, the connection between science fiction and technologies. So obviously, science fictions will be inspired by science and technologies, but at the same time, science fiction is also exploring the imagination of science and technologies. So I want to know, for the Chinese science fiction writers, what are the interaction between them and the Chinese scientists and technological workers? And also, one word about our institute. We focus on the new ideas in this era of transformation. If you have followed our activities, you know that we have been promoting cross-sectoral innovative ideas and how these ideas can be incubated. So our researchers come from art, science, and humanities and social sciences. So today we have invited experts who are really multidisciplinary talents. So I really look forward to their ideas. So I think that's all of my remark. I really look forward to the next the forum. Thank you.
Welcome, and to some of you, welcome back. It's a real honor to be here to organize the second Global AI Narratives China workshop together with the Berggruen Research Center at Peking University. AI narratives in Chinese science fiction is, as Songbing just mentioned, the second in a series of workshops that we are co-organizing as part of the Global AI Narratives project at the Leverhulme Center for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. And at the first workshop in the series, on the 18th of August this year, we focused on AI narratives in Chinese classics and their influence on society today, where we had a fascinating gathering of 4 experts who covered this topic from historical, philosophical, and artistic perspectives. And for those of you who missed that workshop, there's a summary and video highlights on our website, ainarratives.com. And also for those of you who aren't familiar with the wider Global AI Narratives project, I'll give a very brief introduction. So this project is led by myself and Stephen Cave and emerged from research started in 2017. Where under the heading AI narratives, we investigated the portrayals and perceptions of AI in the English-speaking world. So what the dominant narratives look like and how they stereotype the technology, those who build it, and those who are affected by it. So from this research emerged a book titled AI Narratives and a report for a non-academic audience. And in that work, some of the main themes which remain at the center of our work emerged early, in particular the extent to which portrayals of intelligent machines are anthropomorphized and correspondingly gendered and racialized. And we have at CFI 2 projects, AI and Gender and Decolonizing AI, in which we are examining that in more depth. For instance, Stephen Cave's and my paper on the whiteness of AI, which came out in August, looks at the racialization of real robots, virtual assistants, stock images, and AI in fiction. And the Western and indeed the English-speaking tradition was our starting place because it's the cultural sphere with which we are most familiar, and one that is arguably disproportionately influential. For example, it's the cultural sphere that pervades the AI researchers of Silicon Valley. But the impact of AI will be truly global, and managing it for the benefit of everyone will require international or cross-cultural collaboration. Different cultures see AI through very different lenses with diverse religious, linguistic, philosophical, literary, and cinematic traditions have led to different conceptions of intelligent machines. To build trust and collaboration across cultures, we must understand these different ways of seeing what AI can and should be. And this is why we set up the Global AI Narratives project in 2018, which emphasizes the narratives outside the English-speaking West, including narratives from countries that have AI technologies imposed on them from outside and rising AI superpowers. And in this project, through a series of workshops around the world, we're developing a global network of people who work and think in the field of AI narratives in the broadest sense. Our team has now grown to 5 people. We have 3 great research assistants. Elizabeth Seeger has been our assistant on the China workshops. And we have so far held virtual, due to COVID, and in-person workshops in Singapore, Japan, Russia, Egypt, China, Germany, and just last week in Czechia. So what we've learned so far has been extremely exciting, and I'd recommend you to have a look at the blog posts on our website, ainarratives.com, to learn more about each region. So this research is far from finished, but it has already revealed in surprising ways how powerful storytelling about AI is in different parts of the world as people try to come to terms with immense technological changes. And I look forward to hearing today how Chinese science fiction anticipates such a future. Thank you.
I would like to give the floor to Wu Yan to make your keynote speech. Okay, thank you, moderator. And thank you, Madam Hoa Jingfang, for giving me this opportunity. So actually, before this, several years ago, we have some foreign experts. They have talked about this workshop as a plan, but I was not capable to participate in the workshop. But now with Hoa Jingfang and the Institute establishing this project, I feel very happy, and I want to share some slides with you. So just now I listened to the moderator about the cultural foundation and also about the desired future. And maybe I'm not in such a good position to answer these questions, but I will try my best to share with you what I know. So my topic is Chinese AI science fiction in the early period of reform and opening up from 1976 to 1983. So AI is very prevalent nowadays, but you know, for this picture, I was in the garage and this is an AI vehicle. So I took a picture with this AI vehicle. And I want to say that currently artificial intelligence is a very important genre in China's science fictions with increasing quantity and quality, winning a lot of awards. But actually the origin of such a genre can be dated back to before reform and opening up. So let me review what are the different categories and or quasi AI science fiction before reform and opening up. So if we look at past work, you can see that in 1965, the son of Ye Shengtao, Ye Zhishan, these two are father and son in the picture. So they have written a novel which was published in this novel called Elephant Whose Trunk Was Cut Off. And the name of the novel is The Story of Meitonao and Computers. So this child brought the computer to the school, and this computer was composed of 200,000 electronic tubes, and they're just like 200,000 neurons. So they can collect data and organize data. They can also do translation and also machine management. So this is really very close to what we regard as AI today. They are using machine as a brain, although in this novel, there is no explicit mentioning of artificial intelligence. And then a very famous writer, Tong Wenzheng, who is also an archaeologist, published this novel called The Missing Robot. So The Missing Robot was about this robot with a square head, and then he participated into a club, and then he could cross the street and play chess game with other people. So this is also one of the early works related to artificial intelligence. And actually in the same year, there was a film called The Little Sun in China. And in this film, the same image also appeared in this film. And then in the first 17 years of the People's Republic of China, in 1965, written by Xiao called Mysterious Machine Dog. So this machine dog can do a lot of things, very complicated behaviors. And in this novel, the author regarded as the artificial intelligence machine. So this is the earliest written record of artificial intelligence appearing in China before the Cultural Revolution. And also we have some other fragmented pieces of work, and they have some characteristics. First, the difference among computers, AI, and robots are very blurry. These concepts are used interchangeably. And second, all this work emphasize education. They emphasize that you can't rely on computers, you can't trust computers, computers are just your assistants. So they emphasize education and servitude, and also all of them are children's literature. And most importantly, artificial intelligence has already appeared in this period of time. So that was the first 17 years after People's Republic of China was founded. And then after the Cultural Revolution, science fiction have been resumed. And then we have seen more science fictions in China. So that's my goal for this presentation. That is from 1978 to 1983. So on one hand, there's been a continuance of a quasi-AI science fiction. For example, this is Zheng Wenguang, and he wrote a novel called Number 7 of Women's Volleyball. So actually, the number 7 player is actually a robot, and she not only play chess game, but also participates in the volleyball. He can collaborate with human beings in a volleyball game. So this is already quite complicated activity. And also, this is also similar. And I think this is very interesting. So because back then, China's artificial intelligence sci-fi is very closely related to sports. You can see this novel called Hello, Coach Iron. This is about how the coach helped the motorists to train themselves. But the players really despise Coach Iron because Coach Iron is made of iron. But in very critical moments, when the motorists are doing the exercise and they are tripped by a stone, and in this very critical and dangerous moment, the Coach Iron saved their lives. And then Coach Iron fell off the cliff and sacrificed his life to save the lives of the human beings. So this is already beyond the behavior of a sports coach. It has more deeper, it has more sophisticated rationale for behavior and data processing. So this is another very interesting story, which is called the spy case outside the pitch. So in this game organized in other countries, and in the H harbor, there was a robot company, and this robot company thinks that the best player of the Chinese soccer team is number 44. So number 44, they believe number 44 is the robot. So they dispatched a spy to record this person to prove that he is a robot. And then the public security intervened, and they dispatched this detective and said that this is completely made up. It's impossible. So if you can prove this player is a robot, then they will copy the apparatus of the AI to improve the algorithm. And if they can't prove that this is a robot, then they want to dispose this scandal of the Chinese soccer team, because the Chinese soccer team actually cheated by having this robot player. So, and this person said that we have observed this player for more than 10 years. You know, his facial expression never changed. So obviously he's a robot. And as a result, the public security said that, you know, China now invents a cell. The cell can maintain your use forever. This has nothing to do with robotics. Although it has nothing to do with robotics, but it reflects writers' attitudes and views of robots in this period of time. And it was published in the magazine called New Sports. So as you can see, sci-fi is a very popular genre in the sports sector. And in this slide, this is a romance story combining man and robots, and this is about the playing of chess game, the ape man and the robots, and this is the reader of beta, gamma, and alpha. They have their own characteristics. These three robots are interconnected, but with human intervention, they want to utilize these three robots to realize their conspiracy. So all these should not be regarded as real AI sci-fi, because they are only quasi-AI, because there is no very explicit description and rationale of AI. And then I want to introduce this very famous author in 1965. He was the person that first coined the word artificial intelligence in Chinese literature. He was born in 1930, and he majored in wireless electronics, and then he worked in a factory in Beijing of wireless electronics equipment. And so he was very interested in this regard, and he has written a number of novels, especially after 1978. So let me introduce some of them. For example, The Best Solution for the Omnipotent Service Company. So in this novel, starting from a watch, the author described the whole process of algorithm, and then how to use this algorithm to find loved ones and family relatives who have been missing for many years. So he has not mentioned algorithm, but he attempted to talk about the problem of algorithm. So this was in 1979. Then in 1980, in Renmin Literature magazine, he published Professor Shalom's Misconception. And in that period of time, there was a few science fiction, and the magazine, People's Literature, do not place great value on science fiction. So in this novel, the computer company is trying to do artificial intelligence. So they have manufactured the parents of AI, and the parents adopted a kid, and this kid is a human being. So through the cultivation of this kid by the AI parents, he wants to show the influence and the power of the AI parents. But in the end, the kid actually ran away from the home. So Professor Shalom, who manufactured the AI, was actually quite confused and was at a loss. So in this work, the author was already talking about the learning of knowledge and machine learning and machine processing, and how machine can find the best solution for the kid, for how to raise the kid. So then in 1982, he published another article in Renmin Literature called Adventure of Robert Qiao Er. Because in that period of time, there are a lot of conferences in China. So besides doing business, people are having conferences every day. So one conference goer was so tired of going to conferences that he invented this robot to replace him to go to the conference. And so this robot was completely like the real person to replace him to go to the conference. So Xiao Jianheng was always trying to explore the relationship between man and robot in his work. And then there was another magazine called Wisdom Tree, and he published another article called The Special Mission. And then this special mission was compiled into the book. So in this book, some primary school children met some aliens, and they communicated with the UFOs. And then they found people who are not like aliens, but who are actually aliens. But then they found out that the UFO is not from aliens. The UFO is actually manufactured by China. And actually those aliens are not aliens. They are artificial intelligence with independent awareness. So they are doing these very complicated experiments. So for example, if Chinese people go on board the UFO to other planets, what will happen? Or if aliens take the UFO to Earth, what will happen? So in this mutual interaction, was a very special mega experiment. And what's behind the experiment is these fake aliens, which is actually artificial intelligence. So Xiao Jianheng has actually done a lot of experiments in this genre throughout his life. So I think he was like one of the early pioneers in science fiction in China about artificial intelligence. And I want to share with you this writer, Jung Yuanji, and he is very popular for writing a lot of children's stories and fables. And he also wrote this novel called The Riot on the Ziwei Island that shocked the world, which is a science fiction AI novel. So in this Ziwei Island, scientists built a city, and in this city, the robots started to compete with human beings, and they have kidnapped all the scientists. So in this isolated island, the scientists are kidnapped by the robots, so they want to escape. So in this novel, it describes how the scientists try to escape, but failed again and again. Then in the third time, finally, they succeeded. So they escaped the island, and then they brought military forces to fight back and just eliminated all the robots on the islands. So this was a very interesting novel because this was about how AI is doing experiment on human beings. So it's because in the past, human beings do the Turing test on machines, but this is on the contrary. This is reversed because robots are doing experiments on human beings. And in the end of the novel, the author writes that machines will never defeat human beings. So how can you arrive at such a conclusion? This was very interesting. And these three writers are very important. Wei Yahua. So in 1980, in Beijing's literature, he published this novel called Dear Delusion. So in Dear Delusion, it was about scientists are creating artificial intelligence. And first, some introduction about that period of time, because in Chinese culture, we prefer boys to girls. So as a result, there was a disproportion between male and female. So this would create problems of marriage. So as a result, a lot of robots designed for marriage were created, and the robots got married with the protagonist. And after they get married, they will do experiments. And in this experiment, there are a lot of problems because this is quite secretive and confidential. And the protagonist would just be very angry. And when he was so angry with the robot wife thought that there was something wrong with the design of the scientist. So the robot destroyed all the materials for the experiment. And the protagonist was so angry that he wanted to divorce his robot wife. So this was very interesting. And then there was a follow-up story that is in court. They want to recreate artificial intelligence. So they will provide background and the knowledge base for the robot to reconstruct morality and to recreate the catalog or the menu of artificial intelligence and morality. The English name is Dear Delusion. And this was actually a very early work. There was nothing so exciting about it. But back then, indeed, it was a very important work expressing artificial intelligence. And it also involves a lot of social and cultural factors. So I will single out these works. And in summary, I just want to mention that on one hand, people begin to pay more attention to things related to algorithm and also the in-depth situational and environmental awareness and in-depth learning, deep learning. And also it will talk about the intentional disguise by AI. For example, the 2001 Odyssey to Space, there was this rebellion and intentional disguise. So this will become more often in this period of time. And after that, so that's basically all of my presentation. And I want to say that ever since that, the sci-fi on AI began to increase. And in recent years, they have become very popular. There has been a boom of sci-fi on AI. For example, in 1994, Liu Wenyang, a young writer, wrote a novel about called The Shining Life, which was a classic in sci-fi in China. It can be ranked among the top 10 in China. So in this novel, he wrote about a young college student who loved his girlfriend very much, but he was not a very brave person, so he does not dare to confess his love. So he made a robot who was just like him, but the robot was short-lived, only have a very short life, just 30 minutes of life expectancy. So within these 30 minutes, this robot must accomplish the most important mission, that is to confess the love to the girlfriend. So this was a very touching, very moving story, because the robot needs to do something that his inventor does not dare to do. So you can see this replacement and also the mutual mirroring of the human beings and the robots. So this was a very early work, and Liu Wenyang actually passed away at the age of 30, so died very young. And also Fei Dao wrote this robots telling story, which was a legendary robot, and also Pan Haitian talking about the story from Liezi, which was more than 2,000 years ago, an ancient Chinese classics. So it was about the king of ancient China met a robot. And then this story was recreated from a new perspective, that is to, based on traditional and ancient culture, we go beyond the reality, because in ancient China, we have a lot of legendary and magic. For example, you can just create a whole army out of thin air. And in this modern novel, it will give life into these old works. And then in 2015, Archie wrote some novels, and among other works. So Archie, I met him on an award ceremony, and people asked him that, do you think AI will replace human beings in the future? He said that, well, sooner or later it will. And now I'm trying to do sci-fi to send this signal of friendliness to AI so that they will spare me instead of eliminating me. So, and also He Tao wrote this war between robots and human beings. It's very interesting. So one day AI wants to save human beings. And then there was an earthquake in the city. And as a result, all the machines were destroyed and all the electricity were attracted to this machine, which transformed this machine to a very ultra strong AI. And also the work of Hoa Jingfang, but she's here, so I will not comment on his work, on her work. And also we have Zhang Bo's work, and also a lot of other works from other colleagues. So these are the works ever after this period of time. So I still have several minutes, so I want to wrap it up. So in this period after 1984, there has been an explosion of science fiction on AI, and these works have become more diversified, and also the competition between human beings and AI, involving a lot of controversy on ethics and morality. And actually, this is just a Baidu translation. So I just used the Baidu to translate my presentation. So I just want to say that this was the early stage of AI, and but you know, people don't know AI very much. So their work is quite simplified, and they are not to the point. And then some writers began some in-depth exploration on artificial intelligence. They have their own thinking and their own ideas. And then in technologies, starting from robots to algorithm, from algorithm to ecological and cultural independent learning, and then to establishing moral norms. This is a pathway of development and growth. And socially speaking, people in the beginning, they think that AI are just servants, and then they compete with human beings. And then people are concerned whether the moral constraints for artificial intelligence would be broken, and maybe there will be a war between AI and human beings. So last, I want to say that these early works of AI in the reform and opening up period actually facilitated and contributed to the further growth of AI science fiction, and we still need more research in this period of time. So in our center, that is the Research Center for Science and Human Imagination, Southern University of Science and Technology, we focus on the development of sci-fi work and also artificial intelligence. So we really hope to work with all of you in the future, and I hope that you can pay more attention to our work. So that's all of my presentation. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Wu. Now I will give the floor to Mr. Sanfeng for your presentation. Okay, thank you.
So first of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to this workshop. I'm actually a colleague of Mr. Wu Yan. We both work for the Southern University of Science and Technology. And we were assigned the topic of today's workshop, and we had this division of labor. So he was talking about the AI narratives in the early period after the reform and opening up. And my task is focusing on the narrative of AI in recent Chinese sci-fi. And of course, I think the period we cover might not be the whole period after the reform and opening up, but we each have our own specific focus. First, a brief introduction of the timeline of AI development. AI has always been a very important subject in sci-fi. And I've noticed that there has been a long history of the interaction between AI science and AI-themed sci-fi. If we look at the timeline of AI, the science discipline, we can see some important time nodes, such as Turing test and Deep Blue's defeat of Kasparov, and also IBM's Watson's winning the quiz, and also AlphaGo's defeat of Ke Jie, the world champion of the board game Go. And we can also add AI sci-fi into this timeline. There will be some new discoveries. For example, the earliest robot science fiction was written by Czech science fiction writer Čapek in 1920. So it has been 100 years ever since. Now, after that, a lot of sci-fi writers have taken this kind of talking or thinking robots as their protagonists. And the development of robotics is actually based on the rule of robots that is proposed by the Asimov in 1942. The 3 laws of robot originally was created for the convenience of telling stories. I believe you are all familiar with the rules, but later it became the cornerstone of robot ethics. Many literature, academic literature of robot ethics, they have quoted or they have discussed the 3 laws of robot. They were talking about the space for revision or improvement of the rule. And in 1968, the 2001 A Space Odyssey was released. And the robot called HAL is the famous AI villain. Now, other AI robots also include the Skynet in Terminator. But of course, there are good AIs. For example, in the film Artificial Intelligence that is directed by Spielberg. I believe this timeline gives us a brief idea of the development of sci-fi and also the science of artificial intelligence. I believe there is no simple model to show their relationship. We cannot say that sci-fi has prophetic function or scientific development will inspire sci-fi creation. I believe their relationship is closely intertwined and more complex than we can describe with a simple model. Now let's come back to China. Just now, Mr. Wu talked about the important works of AI and robots in Chinese sci-fi in the late 1970s and early 1980s. There is a rich literature. I should have focused on the sci-fi development in China in 1990s and subsequent development stages. But after thinking about the topic, I decided to focus only on the recent 10 years. Because from my perspective, I think that decades between the 1990 and 2010, there isn't large achievements or breakthroughs in Chinese AI-related sci-fi. But in the recent decade, I have seen many inspiring works. First, this is a chart which shows the word frequency of AI, which is black, and also the word frequency of sci-fi, which is green, during 1991 to 2019. And you see how the word frequency of AI and also sci-fi increased, in particular AI, dramatically after 2010. From my observation, there has been a mushrooming phenomena of AI-related sci-fi. I believe this is also inspired by the AI fever in recent years. And we see in this AI sci-fi, there are a lot of very outstanding works which have two characteristics, and I will focus on them in my presentation today. And first characteristic is about the presentation of algorithm, which is related to the development of AI, the scientific field of AI. And the first school of AI is symbolicism, which means we need to develop an AI system with logics and computer. As long as we can have a very complete and complex logic and intelligent system, we can have very good artificial intelligence. But the mainstream school is called connectionism, which is also known as bionic school. It advocates imitating human neurons and using the connection mechanism of neural networks to realize artificial intelligence. So the transition from symbolicism to connectionism has also been reflected in sci-fi creation, and some writers have tried to bring this transition into their works. In previous sci-fi works, actually the writers did not mention intentionally or unintentionally, where the soul or consciousness of robots come from. So if we carefully investigate their work, we can see the behavior logic of robots in these sci-fi works. They are actually consistent with symbolicism. And this is also in line with the historical development of the scientific area of AI. And one of the example is The Song of Life, written by Hoa Jingfang, which was published in 1996. There was a wild idea in the work. In his story, he said people's DNA sequences can be turned into songs, and if we play the song to AI or to robots, and then we can awaken the robot by giving them a desire of survival. And this kind of process will give them a life, will give the robot a life. It will help them to develop human mental system. So that's the basic idea of Song of Life. And in this novel, actually, the logic of AI is the survival desire. So in this way, I believe this is a symbolicism. But today, we have realized that the soul of AI is more likely to come from the learning algorithm. And today's sci-fi writers, if they are familiar with these facts, or if they want to explore these scientific facts, then they can incorporate these basic facts into their writings. And in this way, the existence and implementation of learning algorithm can become the focus of their AI narratives. Another example is called The Life Cycle of Software Objects. In this novel, written by Ted Chiang, it is about the whole learning process of AI. And in this novel, the AI is has a very high level of maneuverability and credibility. And I believe the learning algorithm helps to give more life to AI robots. Many Chinese sci-fi writers, they have been trying to incorporate connectionism into their work. One example would be a novelette called Let's Have a Talk, written by Xia Jia. It's about AI being locked in black boxes, how they learned from each other, and how they developed their own languages. And this process actually resembles the learning process of AlphaGo. Another example is Where Are You?, written by Miss Hoa Jingfang. And the AI, the robots in these novelette is actually enabled by big data and also learning algorithms so that they can create their avatar. Of course, it's a virtual avatar. It means people can create an avatar, but of course, this novelette is a little bit pessimistic. And another example is The Image Maker, written by Chen Qiufan. This story is about the logic of neural network learning algorithm. AI enabled by this learning algorithm can shoot very beautiful pictures and pictures with soul and artistic emotion. Another example is written by love in times of difficulties, written by a young sci-fi writer called Jung Yuanji. It was published in 2018. It's about an AI with a function of predict earthquakes. Of course, the list is very long. I won't name all of them. Here, I would like to mention another very extreme example. Just now, Mr. Wu have mentioned this. It is a classic story in ancient China. It is called Yan Shi Creates Man. And we see in today's sci-fi world, many writers, they have been trying to reproduce the similar story as the Yan Shi Creates Man. And I have listed them on this slide. They have beautiful words and very specific Chinese style. But none of them have made it clear where did the soul of the door come from? Where does the intelligence of the door come from? Another work that I read recently is Dream Making, written by Mu Ming, that was published in 2019. And the story was situated in ancient China. It's in the times of spring and autumn. There is a craftsman help the king to produce AI-enabled a door with the help of learning algorithm. And I have showed some excerpts from this novel. It mentioned the importance of learning to adapt to the environment very quickly and try to maximize the advantage and minimize the disadvantage. So this shows the logic of machine learning. Of course, it is situated in ancient China, but still the spirit or the principle is the same. This is very similar to the silk punk style of Liu Yukun. The second characteristics of recent Chinese sci-fi is the invasion of reality. It has made AI closer, much closer to our daily life. Actually, AI sci-fi reveals the relationship between artificial intelligence and people. In AI narratives, there are three kinds of time imagination: close-range imagination, medium-range imagination, and long-range imagination. And it roughly corresponds to weak AI, strong AI, and super AI. Traditional Chinese AI sci-fi, they are actually long-term, long-range imagination. For example, 2185, written by Liu Zixing. In this story, AI is like a master, like a housekeeper who's in charge of the whole country. And AI became a quasi leader of the world and how he had a conflict with the real leader of the country. And a more recent example, Exorcism, written by Han Song. And the hospital ship is a kind of AI with different style. And even close range or medium range imagination feel a little bit distant from our ordinary people and our daily life. Most of them are more like fables. They are very good stories, but we can't feel them in our daily life. So in this way, they are still traditional sci-fi works. But I believe there is a growing number of sci-fi works that is showing the invasion of our real life, the invasion of reality. It is more of this kind of close-range imagination. Of course, this might be a challenge for Chinese sci-fi writers, but I think there are very good role models in the West. For example, Black Mirror, and another example would be the film Her. Black Mirror in particular has been a great inspiration for Chinese sci-fi writers. Its influence cannot be underestimated. A lot of Chinese writers would like to write a Black Mirror style story in Chinese context. I believe there are several good efforts have been made. For example, 涉江, this is a short story written by Xia Jia. And the story is about, is like an encyclopedia. In this story, AI can reproduce the dead. It will enable the communication between the living and the dead. It might remind you of the recent news that a Korean mother reunited with her daughter through virtual reality. Another similar story written by Bao Shu is called Nyonyo. It was published in 2019. This story is very similar to Shejiang. It's about a couple who lost their daughter and cannot accept the reality. They decided to produce an AI to replace the daughter. But with limited material to learn from, the AI can only mimic a short period of the growth of the development of the daughter. So this is a sad story. And both stories, they are very similar to one episode in Black Mirror. It's about the relationship between the dead and the living, and how AI can help us to reunite with the dead. But of course, I believe because these stories are produced in different contexts, we may find differences in these similar stories. the feelings of the protagonists might be different in the Western story and in Chinese story. Another example I would like to mention is there are two examples actually. One is called The Problem of Love, written by Hoa Jingfang. Another one is called The Life Algorithm, written by Chen Qiufan. And in their stories, they reflected the reality. The love problem is about how people's emotions and behaviors must be judged by AI. And if there is no score from AI, people will doubt themselves, will doubt their own feelings. And the life algorithm is about the remaking of choices in one's life with the help of AI. It's about time travel. And these stories provide a great sense of technology. And it's a fantasy, but to some extent, it is like the virtual reality. So to sum up, if you read all these works written by the recent generation of Chinese sci-fi writers, I think they have made one achievement. That is, in the face of ubiquitous and omnipotent artificial intelligence, they are trying to reflect the feelings of ordinary people and try to answer the questions that we have for the development of AI. They are showing the anxieties of people in face of this rapid development of AI. Sci-fi writers, they have great imaginations, but with the development of AI science, they also face a lot of challenges. So to conclude, I would like to recommend one story written by Shuang Chimu. His academic background is from philosophy. And this story called Cock Prince is very interesting because it shows the 4 Chinese ancient principles to replace the 3 rules of Asimov. And the 4 don'ts principle is see no evil, don't listen to evil, don't speak to evil, and don't touch evil. And Shuang Chimu has been proposing these 4 don't criterion to replace the 3 laws of robots. And I quote, be it human being or artificial intelligence, they should try to discipline themselves. And this is the starting point of the AI ethics. And I believe this, from his philosophical background, this is very interesting. And also there are a lot of works written about AI invasion, but our AI, they are also creating, they can also create, they can write novels. So in Chen Qiufan's recent work, it's about an experiment. It's an experiment about co-creation by sci-fi writers in the AI to create AI-themed works. So this is very interesting. And this shows the pioneering spirit of AI, of sci-fi writers. They are trying to experiment with this new technology and with their literature.
So in terms of algorithm, because of algorithm, so the credibility of AI is enhanced. And also some excellent authors have focused on the near future and how AI is comprehensively penetrated and integrated into the daily life. So they are focusing on the emotions, ethics, and moral conflicts brought by the penetration of AI in the near future. So these are the breakthroughs, and I hope that the sci-fi writers can be the pioneers and they can lead the artificial intelligence development, and they can describe the near future for us so as to alleviate our anxiety as common people. So that's all of my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Sanfeng, for your comprehensive introduction of the AI sci-fi in the recent 10 years. Now we enter the Q&A session, which will be moderated by Hoa Jingfang. And also we will answer some questions posted by participants on Bilibili. So, hello. Thank you so much for participating in this event. And you have done a very good job in your presentations. And even I haven't read some of the science fictions you mentioned. And I really wanted to read those science fictions after this event. And we have collected many questions from Bilibili. And these netizens are really enthusiastic. So one question for Wu Yan. So in the previous sci-fi, is there any work supporting the egalitarian right for artificial intelligence? Because traditionally we are just exaggerating the confrontation between AI and human beings or competition between them. But is there any work supporting the equal rights of artificial intelligence? Okay, thank you, Jingfang. Thank you for whomever asked this question. So maybe you should pay attention to Wei Yahua's work, The Delusion, and also How I Divorced My Robot Wife. So after the divorce, there have been lawsuits and litigations, and the lawyers will replace the female to speak up. So there has been a series of legal confrontation. So maybe we can pay attention to Wei Yahua's work. So that's very interesting because you divorced a robot. So there will be a lot of ethical considerations. And also a question for Sanfeng. So for China's science fictions on AI, so based on computer science, in the future, will there be more AI science fiction based on the development of computer science? So is there a very close connection between science fictions and computer science? Or can we say that the science fictions are mainly based on storytelling? So I think there are two paths of learning. One path is that we have a lot of novels related to robots and AI. And I have read their works, for example, Asimov and other classic robot novels. And maybe after reading these novels, they think that they have something to say themselves. So they will just talk about science fictions for science fiction's sake. So they are still they are still following this tradition, this traditional path. So this is one path of writing. The other path, which I appreciate more, is that sci-fi on AI can be better integrated with the development of computer science and artificial intelligence. For example, I mentioned some excellent work on AI. Most of them are closely integrated with the mainstream AI theory and AI logics. So they have already realized that the development of AI is not done overnight. It's not like a HAL or Skynet. They will not awaken overnight. The awakening of AI will not be done magically. It must be done over a long period of time of training, algorithm, and simulation, so that there will be strong AI or even ultra AI in the future. So if you just jump to the long-term future, then if you don't pay attention to the development of algorithm and computer science, if you don't pay attention to the science of AI, then the credibility of your work will not be very high, especially for those readership who has already known a lot about AI. So you, on one hand, you should read the traditional AI science fiction, but on the other hand, you should really try to get more nutrition from the development and advancement of sciences so as to get your inspiration. So for both paths, we should strike a balance between them. So that's a very good answer. And another topic is how science can influence sci-fi. And another question is how science fiction can shape the development of science and technology. So actually, I have interviewed two scientists in China. One is from Chinese Academy of Science doing AI research. Another is doing research on robotics in Shenzhen. They said that science fiction has influenced them. One of them said that I watched the film Artificial Intelligence by Spielberg, and another one also said that he watched a film and read a novel on AI. So that's why they started up their entrepreneurial startup businesses. So both of them said that they are influenced by science fiction. So Sanfeng, do you think there are any other such examples? So actually there are a lot of such examples because I have paid a lot of attention to this. You mentioned that actually for a lot of innovators and scientists, there are some points where science fiction can influence them. For example, the first one is when they are young, in their childhood. Maybe in their childhood, they are affected by a certain science fiction work, and then they set this ambition to engage in science and technology. There are a lot of famous examples. There are a lot of scientists who would tell you that when they were in their childhood, they were inspired by a certain science fiction, and then they decided to devote themselves to science and technology. Well, I will not talk about Musk here. Let me give you an example of an economist, Krugman, Paul Krugman, and he is the Nobel economic winner. He said that he was very interested in the laws made by Asimov. So he wanted to use the big data to calculate the development, the future development of mankind. But there's no such discipline. So the closest is economist. So that's why he chose economics. And also there are two other Nobel Prize laureates who mentioned that they chose their discipline because of the influence of a science fiction. And so in the future, if you want to engage in innovation, then you need some ideas. So in the incubation of your ideas, some science fiction can play their role. Let me give you an example, but the examples have not been verified. Of course, there are verified examples. For example, satellites by Clark, which have become a reality, which is a source of innovation for us. And also the Star Trek, the portable iPad, the telecommunication equipment, which has become a reality, or that is the prototype of the portable intelligent telecommunication equipment. So these examples have been verified. And also, in terms of the spreading of innovation, the dissemination of innovation, there have been psychologists who have studied that if you show ordinary people stories of AI, good stories, warm stories, then they will not be so scared of robots. They will accept robots more. So the dissemination of innovation can really benefit from science fiction. So about the relationship between science fiction and science and technology, maybe in the future, I will do more research in this regard. And I hope that through more research, I can better answer this question. Okay, I really look forward to that. That's very great. Next question for Wu Yan. You have reviewed the history of China's sci-fi on AI. And one question is, in the past decades, Soviet Union has provided some influence and inspiration for China. So what are the influence? Because this is quite interesting, and I have seen few studies in this respect. Have you carried out any research in this respect? Well, this is a good question indeed. Before 1949, Soviet Union has already influenced the Chinese sci-fi creation. If you look at early 1940s, we still talk about the scientific novels, but later we call them sci-fi because we are influenced by Soviet Union. So, you know, both China's mainland and Taiwan province of China regard this as sci-fi because we are influenced by Soviet Union. And another thing is that in the 1950s, China and Soviet Union had a very good relationship. So we introduced a lot of Soviet Union works into China. For example, Shalom, he told me that please pay attention to this novel. This novel was all about artificial intelligence. It's called X1. So how this X1 machine can predict economic development in the future. And another novel, another magazine is called Knowledge is Power. This magazine was from Soviet Union, and we translated the Soviet Union, the Russian articles, and then we started to add our own articles. And this is another article called Su Aima, a story about a robot. It was published in 1965. And people have begun to criticize science fictions because they think that this is not in line with the Marxist principles. Because in this story, robots will fight the scientists and they want to use the knives to hurt the scientists. But later scientists defeated the robots. So actually before 1966, the influence from the Soviet Union is actually very great. Okay, thank you very much. The next question for Wu Yan. So the Chinese readership of sci-fi, who are these readership of sci-fi in China? Have you ever carried out any survey? Well, I haven't, but I was told that mainly the young people, the younger generation, the teenagers, although in recent years there have been some changes. For example, many adults are also reading sci-fi, but mainly the readership is concentrated in college students and middle school students and even primary school students. Well, maybe it's because most students would read magazines, but many adults would just buy books. They would not subscribe to magazines. But indeed, we have a very scattered and fragmented distribution of readership of sci-fi, unlike the concentration in other countries. The next question for both of the presenters, that is, sci-fi mainly focus on dystopia, but are there any positive description of utopia? Because utopia is a positive term It's a perfect ideal world that does not exist. So utopia is positive in the original sense. But later, some sci-fi are mainly focusing on dystopia in a negative sense. So are there any sci-fi that is more positive on utopia, on the description of utopia? Well, for the positive utopia, in early time, we have a lot of positive utopia. There's a new example related to your work, and also the called wandering Mars or wandering sky or wandering heaven. So in this novel, Mars and Earth, these two universes are just two different utopia. There's nothing good or bad about them. They're just two different concepts or different philosophies. So the wandering heaven or wandering sky is one example. And why this dystopia is so popular? Well, I think that's mainly because storytelling is very easy, because it has conflicts, it has drama, and if you look at dystopia, the core elements is control. For the big companies, for the authoritarian governments and regimes, they can control individuals. They can control individuals through technologies and ideologies. But when human beings want to pursue freedom and liberty, so that's why you can write these novels of rebellion. That's why I think stories of dystopia really have this cliche. They have this beaten path of storytelling. They have this rehearsed, like a pre-established plot, because such stories are something we like to listen to. But if you talk about utopia, it's so hard for storytelling. It's so hard to tell an attractive story. And Wu Yan, well, I want to talk about something else. In the Chinese culture, there is no concept of utopia. And in our traditional culture, for example, when Taoism is talking about this, where they talk about a small country with a small population, people don't talk with each other throughout their entire life. So if we call this utopia, actually this is not the same with utopia. And also for Confucianism talk about morality, governance based on morality. This is also not the same with utopia, because in Chinese culture, there is no such utopia at all. So when we try to write novels like this, there will be a problem. That is, we simply cannot write such stories. And when I read literature in late Qing dynasty and the Ming dynasty, if you want to write something about utopia, they will never finish their work. They never finish their work. They will just abandon their work after writing few chapters, and they will never finish their work. And also, Meng Weizai wrote a work just finishing the first chapter. So I think to write about utopia is very difficult in China. But Zheng Wenguang wrote something, for example, the construction of Mars, the builder of Mars, that won an award in the Soviet Union. So countries around the world want to explore the Mars. And in this process, they have fostered this alliance of youth. So can we say this is a utopia? Maybe we should do more research about it. And also Sanfeng mentioned the dystopia. Well, dystopia should mainly reflect on the psychology and the mentality of the youth. Why the young people like dystopia so much? For example, Twilight and many other works. Why young people are so like them so much? Because the young people will enter this period of a rebellious period. So that's why they are naturally attracted to dystopia. So maybe dystopia is related to a certain period of time in your age. And also in Chinese culture, we are quite inclusive. For example, Liang Qichao, attempted utopia, and for the 1984 was translated in 1974. Actually, from 1974 to 1973, it is unimaginable for 1984 to be translated into Chinese because we are doing cultural revolution. So actually, there's so much more to research in this regard. And I want to echo your comments. Well, when Chinese are writing utopia, they have two sources of inspiration. The first is the so-called the world under the same heaven, the world of sameness, and the other is the communism ideal. Maybe these provide some inspiration for us to write about utopia. Indeed, we don't enjoy abundant resources of inspiration when we write utopia. Yes, we also have this so-called globalism with Chinese characteristics. Maybe that can be one source of inspiration. So in ancient China, we mainly focus about, peace under heaven, sameness under heaven, sameness in the world. We don't talk about a certain state or certain country. We just focus on universal peace under the heaven. So just a pure peace. We seldomly substantiate this ideal in a certain concrete system or concrete mechanism. And another question is about AI replacing human beings' jobs. Well, I wrote a Folding Beijing, and I mentioned that AI will replace our jobs. So is there any AI work that can give us a good solution?
There has been a lot of discussion about human jobs being replaced by AI. Ordinary people are anxious about this prospect, and there are a lot of novels on this topic as a response to the anxiety. And in most of the novels, human beings and AIs, they are in conflict with each other. And Mr. Wu, I just mentioned a novel, and in that novel, the protagonist says it is inevitable that our job would be replaced by AI. I can give you an example, a story written by a Japanese writer. That is The Dream of Ibis. It is a collection of 7 AI stories. Some of the stories are really warm and they are comforting. And in these stories, there is peaceful coexistence between human beings and robots. And I really recommend this collection. And I recommend you to read each novelette of it. I think there are 2 role models for Chinese sci-fi writers. One is The Life Cycle of Software Machine, written by Jiang, and the other one is what I have mentioned, The Dream of Ibis from a Japanese writer. Thank you, Sanfeng. You really read a lot of sci-fi works. You're like an encyclopedia of science fictions of AI. Let's take one more question from the floor. You all mentioned that there is this kind of AI stories about AI enables the living to meet the dead, and there are this kind of news in our real life. Can you talk about the difference between Chinese stories of this topic and Western stories. So the differences in terms of the human feeling, their emotion in their narratives, and also the family relationship. What do you think are the difference? So what about leaving this question to our panel discussion? Because we will invite the two writers on this topic and they can share more. So what about your observation? I believe you read a lot of sci-fis. So can you talk about the difference between Chinese sci-fi and Western sci-fis? And I think you can read Dr. Shalom's Misconception. This is about a story in a family. The couple raised an AI child. From my observation, religion plays an important role in Chinese and Western feeling towards AI. In Western families, religion is a great bond, uniting everybody. But in Chinese families, we don't have this idea of religion, or let's say we don't have the religious tradition. This Oriental relationship quite different in that they are more restraining. And if you read AI stories both from China and from the West on the same topic of AI enabling the living to meet the dead, you will see when the living meet the dead, they will have different responses. For example, the Westerners will have stronger feelings, and for the Chinese, their feelings will be more subtle, or let's say they have profound feelings, but they don't reflect it. In a Chinese story, there is more discussion about how the family members communicate with each other, but that's just my observation. I don't have a close investigation of these kind of stories, but I think religion plays a very important role. Thank you, Mr. Wu Yan and Mr. San Feng. We were talking about relationship in Western culture and in Chinese culture. From psychological perspective, Chinese people suffer from a lot of mental ill health due to their poor family relations. I think this to some extent reflects these kind of differences. And the question, I believe, pointed to a very important and very interesting area of study for our further exploration. So with that, I would like to conclude the first session of today's workshop. Thank you for your presentations and your answers to the questions. So in the next part, we will have more panelists, and we can invite sci-fi writers to answer your questions. So it's a 10-minute tea break. Please come back in 10 minutes.
Again, good evening. So I'm very happy to participate in this roundtable of science fiction. And I hope that this topic will give you some pleasure during your dinner time. So our discussion has been very pleasant and relaxing. And on the topic of AI, let's just take full advantage of our imagination. And today I have invited some of my best friends. All of them are excellent sci-fi writers and researchers, including Bao Shu, Fan Feidao, and Xia Jia. I have known them for more than 10 years, and all of them have been making a lot of efforts in science fiction in China. So now I will just give the floor to all of them for some brief self-introduction, their experience in sci-fi, their representative works, and what they are doing now. So maybe 5 minutes for each to make a self-introduction. And I hope that all of you can focus more on your AI works and your attitudes and views on AI. So lady first. So I will give the floor to Xia Jia first, and then the three gentlemen later. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Jingfang. So hello, my name is Xia Jia. Actually, Xia Jia is my pen name. So back in the early 2000s, I began to write sci-fi novels, and it has been more than 10 years. So sci-fi has really changed my life trajectory because actually I majored in physics in undergraduate studies, but I really like sci-fi. So for my postgraduate and doctoral studies, I turned to cinematology and literature. And my PhD dissertation is about the contemporary sci-fi literature in China, spanning 30 years in China. And after graduation, now I am teaching in Xi'an Jiaotong University, engaged in both research and teaching. And now I also research science fiction, and I teach lessons on science fiction. And in last year, I was serving as a visiting scholar in UC Riverside in California, and I just returned back to China. So in this semester, I offered 2 courses on science fiction. One is in English for Chinese students, the other is in English for international students. And actually, I just finished one lesson about the man-made people. So from robot to AI, there are so many related topics. And in recent years, in terms of my own creation, I have some fix-up work. They are just short short novels, and they are a series entitled China's Encyclopedia. And last year, one chapter was published in After Tomorrow called the Monk of the Lingyin Temple. And this year, I finished another one called The Mars Architect. So actually, I'm not very fast in my creation, but I focus more on the current issues because this series is mainly focusing on the near future, on the Chinese society and issues closely related to people's daily lives, how people's lives have been changed by technologies and how people respond to these changes. So for the AI issue, maybe I will talk about that later. So maybe the other speakers can introduce themselves first. Okay, thank you very much, Xia Jia. You are very humble. You have not focused on your great achievements, actually. Actually, Xia Jia published 2 excellent collections of science fictions. And she has also won the Yinghe Award of science fiction. And she was also very popular among Chinese sci-fi fans. And she has carried out a lot of research in sci-fi. So she actually knows a lot about not only Chinese, but also international sci-fi works. So from your perspective, maybe you can share with you more excellent views. And then I will give the floor to Chen Qiufan. Please make a self-introduction. Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Good evening, my name is Chen Qiufan. Actually, this afternoon, I just flew from Beijing to Shanghai. So as you can see behind me, this is the night scene of Shanghai. And actually with Xia and Bao Shu, I graduated from Peking University. And together with Jingfang and Fei Dao, I have known them for more than 10 years. We are good friends. And we started from fans of sci-fi, then we become writers, researchers, or practitioners of the sci-fi industry. So it's my honor, my great honor to participate in this discussion. And actually, in the end of 1980s, I have read sci-fi works from the West, and I started my own creation. And then at the age of 16, I published my first sci-fi work. And in recent years, I have been working in, for example, Apple and Baidu, among other technology companies. But now and then I resigned and I become a startup entrepreneur in sci-fi. And then in 2016, Ken Liu translated my work called Waste Tide into English. And then it was also translated into dozens of other languages. And in recent time, for AI and also the relationship between AI and mankind, I'm very interested in how to describe this relationship. And also, I have another work called The Algorithm for Life, which is a collection of 6 stories. They are discussing the coexistence of AI and human beings. So in this world, how should we discuss the agency of human beings and the boundary between technology and human beings and all the structural changes brought by AI and how we should respond to the structural changes. And I'm currently writing another collection of novels together with Dr. Li. In this collection, we have sci-fi stories. We also have actually real stories. So in 2041, how the AI industry is shaping people's lives. So at the end of each story, there will be some scientific analysis, and through such cooperation, we want to take a more realistic perspective to investigate how AI can change people's lives. And this book will be published by Lan Feng, and the English version and other languages version will also be published. So I hope that we can engage in a joint discussion about the reflection of AI in our daily life and the bigger problems and issues lying behind. So thank you so much, Chen Qiufan. In recent days, in several sci-fi forums, we have seen each other. Actually, a few days ago, we have met each other in a sci-fi roundtable, and we have discussed so much about the influence of modern technology and the development of human beings and machines. And there was actually a magazine contacting Chen Qiufan for writing a sci-fi story. So this was a very interesting idea of the joint stock company of life, of one's life. For example, maybe you need a large amount of investment in your own life, but you need to transfer the right of choice of your life in return for the investment. And the algorithm will calculate the probability of your success in a certain direction, and then the investment will be made, but then you will no longer make your own life choices. You have to listen to the algorithm. So as a result, the protagonist is transferring the right of life choices to the algorithm again and again, and he was at a loss and he was so confused. So if there is such an algorithm called Life Joint Stock Company, which is willing to invest 5 million to support your development, but in return, you have to sacrifice all your life choices. You are no longer able to make your life choices. Are you willing to make the sacrifice? Are you willing to do the deal? So the algorithm want to invest in you, but the algorithm also want to control you. Do you accept it or do you refuse it? So maybe you can share with us your views. So this is like a Black Mirror story. And so Mr. Chen is very excited for this story. It shows that for algorithm, big data, and AI, he has his own ideas. The third one is Fei Dao, also my alumni from Peking University, and we have 2 alumni from Tsinghua University. So Fei Dao is in Tsinghua University doing sci-fi research. So please share with us your experience related to AI and sci-fi. So good evening. I'm very happy to participate in this online forum. We have some old friends, but because of COVID-19, we haven't seen each other in person yet. But I'm very happy that I can see you online. You are sound and safe. And actually, I have some similar experience with Jia. In my undergraduate studies, I major in environmental engineering, which is natural science. But I really like science fiction. I want to research science fiction. So that's why I decided to pursue literature. And now, in Tsinghua University, in the Department of Chinese Language and Literature, I engage in teaching and research. So my identity is the same as Jia. I am a university teacher. So I don't have much time to really communicate with young students. Actually, half an hour ago, I just finished another conference in Tsinghua University. That conference invited Yang Ping, another sci-fi writer in China, to participate, and another professor of physics. So that was very interesting because they are talking about the 3-body. And when we are admitting new candidates, we found that many candidates were interested in science fiction. That's why they decided to pursue natural science as their major. This shows that for the younger generation in China, science fictions are very attractive for them. It's an art for them, and they provide the motivation for them to pursue their undergraduate major in natural sciences. And in recent years, I've been learning how to be a qualified teacher. So actually, I'm a slow writer. So now I'm even slower than before, even slower than Jia. Maybe for 1 year, I can just write like 1,000 words. But I cooperated with Chen Qiufan, and she started this program or this experiment of joint creation of human writers and AI writers. So I will cooperate with AI, and we spent just several days to finish a novel that contains more than 10,000 words. So you can see how AI can change human society. I feel like I have created so much more works in this year.
So from this experience, we can judge that AI has become our daily life. So that's all for my self-introduction. Thank you, Fei Dao. I know that you are teaching an AI-related course. Many students in China have become fan of sci-fi, and they have chosen to study science because of this interest in sci-fi. I remember when I entered Tsinghua University, the science club only has about 5 to 10 members. That's not a big crowd. And I remember we don't have a lot of activities, and we don't have this kind of popularities at that time. But from my knowledge, science fiction has become more and more popular in China. We have a lot of good writers and also researchers on science fictions. And I believe we are going to have a larger amount of science fictions. When I was a student, I read works from Fei Dao. So you are really a brilliant writer, and you have a lot of popular works. And I look forward to more contribution to our workshop from you. So next panelist, Bao Shu. He's also from Peking University. He has been very productive in recent years. Last year, he also published a very popular work about AI. Can you talk more about what you have been doing and about your work? Can you hear me? Yes, loud and clear. Hello, everybody. I'm Bao Shu. I'm a sci-fi writer. It's an honor to be invited by Hoa Jingfang to attend this panel discussion. So many of you are friends of me, but this discussion provides a more formal and serious opportunity for us to exchange our ideas. I have been a fan of sci-fi from my childhood. I read a lot of sci-fi stories. And in terms of my own creation, my own production, actually, I'm a latecomer. When I was in PKU, I'm an acquaintance with Fei Dao and Xia Jia. They have been engaged in writing at that time, but I was not. I was writing, but not about science fictions, not about science. And later on, I started my creation of sci-fi, and I gained this freedom of soul. I have a lot of plans for my future production. I would like to focus on cyborg and also about archaeologists. So compared with other writers, I'm not very productive in terms of sci-fi on AI. I was thinking why? And the answer from me is that I don't believe in strong artificial intelligence. I have a collection of my sci-fi works. It's about the monster, the name of the girl. There are several short stories in this collection, and one thing in common is a mistrust, or let's say an opposition to strong AI. One story is about the Galaxy Republic, about the problem that is caused by AI. And it turned out that the ruler wanted the general public to believe in AI, but in fact, the scientific research has proved this AI a total failure. Recently, writer Liu Weijia has edited a collection of sci-fi works from China. This is an interesting collection. I wrote a review for this book. I was reflecting on the relationship between God and artificial intelligence. Of course, we can have more detailed discussions in very soon. And I hope to invite answers for my questions from all these panelists. Thank you, Bao Shu, for your self-introduction. You have also been very modest. You have been quite productive. I read your work, that is The Ruins of Time online, and I'm a fan of it. You challenged several aspects of AI, for example, whether the strong AI can become a reality. I think it's good to be critical. I think we need to reflect and to constantly think about these questions. I myself also wrote a book on this topic. Thinking about the form of a possible strong AI and whether it would become a reality. I know a lot of people are skeptical about strong AI, and for myself, I think there are several reasons for being critical. For example, AI can outperform human being in many aspects, for example, city planning and other aspects that can apply big data. But in some other areas, AI will never outperform human being. For example, the ability to learn, to perceive, and to summarize, or let's say to gain experience from these experiences. For example, for a machine, it has to learn about 10,000 times so as to acquire a scale. But for a human being, for a kid, he would remember that he must do the homework if he was beaten by his parents when he failed to do his homework. So I think in these aspects, artificial intelligence will never outperform human being. And for artificial intelligence enabled robot, it can only specify in one specific area, specialize in one specific area. For example, a chatbot will never be able to play Go. So these are problems for us to reflect on. And also when it comes to empathy and sympathy, how can we incorporate this kind of human feelings to AI? So these are the challenges for AI, for deep learning. But of course, it remained a question whether in the future we can have AI that are enabled by these kind of feelings. But these are several reasons for me to have mistrust in strong AI. So with that, my first question for you is your view about strong AI. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the prospect of strong AI? Do you think it will become a reality in the near future, or do you think it will never become a reality? So any volunteers? If not, I will pick any one of you. What about Bao Shu? Why are you pessimistic? or let's say not very optimistic about strong AI. So when you're writing, a writer usually goes with his intuition. Sometimes we don't rely on rationality, we rely on our intuition. So for the answer to this question, I believe that the future for strong AI is uncertain. It can outperform human being. It can go beyond our wildest imagination. For example, several years ago, AlphaGo beat Kejie in the board game of Go. So that's really a huge shock to human being. From our imagination, we don't believe that a machine created by man can defeat its master, but finally it became a reality. In theory, I don't think we can avoid the prospect of strong AI. But when I'm writing, I have this kind of intuition that I don't believe in strong AI. For me, a strong AI is a smarter human being. I just can't imagine this kind of prospect. Of course, I like very humorous AI or robots. But when I was writing my own works, I don't think it represents a very typical strong AI. For me, a strong AI is something that is terrifying, that is totally strange for me. And I won't depict a strong AI as a kind of human being. I will refrain myself from writing this kind of topic. And because it's beyond my imagination. If it goes beyond, if it's, let's say, it's unlike human being, it might be something like the God. But how could that be possible? And because I'm trained by philosophy, I was thinking about the existence and the creation of consciousness. So I was thinking about the soul problem, the consciousness problem of AI. But of course, as we continue to improve algorithm, the algorithm might go beyond our imagination. But I think it's an open-ended question. When I was standing on the podium talking to my students, I'm afraid of asking, is there any volunteer? So I'd like to be picked by our teacher. Jingfang, you just mentioned that today's AI, they only have single function. They specialize in only one area, but yeah, it's true. But I still think they have outperformed some human beings, just like me, because I cannot play Go or I cannot analyze stocks. So in these aspects, robots have already outperformed me. And they took shorter period of time than me to learn this kind of new skills. So I believe in the prospect of strong AI. So as a teacher, I think you need to encourage volunteers in your class. And maybe can you share with us some academic aspect? So what kind of artificial intelligence do you think are possible to become a reality? the development of AI might not always be linear. So I don't think it's possible to judge what kind of AI imagination can become a reality. In one academic conference, there is a question about how human beings produce knowledge. They want to invite answers from physics and also from the science fiction field. They want to ask whether there would be a ceiling for human beings to gain knowledge. Would it be possible that because of this division of labor or specification that scientists, when they produce knowledge, these knowledge cannot be understood by the general public? Would we reach this kind of ceiling or bottleneck in the production of knowledge? And the answer from physics is that we might need some the paradigms of thinking. We need to change paradigms of thinking in physics. And the answer from science fiction area is that we need to invite AI to participate in our production of knowledge. With their help, we can produce new forms of knowledge. We have developed science to such an extent, but still in our world, some people are anti-science. So the general public's mistrust in science, their mistrust in scientists, is very shocking. Some people believe that our Earth is flat, it's not round, the globe is flat. Can you imagine that? So going forward, if we use AI to produce knowledge, do you think these kind of people would believe in the knowledge that they produce? So that's the question I would like to pose and for you to think about.
So there will be collaboration between man and AI to explore the human society and try to explore new solutions. And maybe we cannot understand such solutions, just like the game of Go. The game of Go is very different from our mindset. So should we accept such suggestions or conclusions? This involves whether AI and human beings can trust each other. So since I am spotted, so I will talk a little bit more about it. And for example, Wandering Earth has this narrative about home. So will this have a certain impact on AI? So in the future, we need in-depth cooperation between man and AI. So if we want to build this mutual trust, it's very difficult. So how do you trust something, or how do you trust the conclusion when you cannot fully understand the mechanism? So this involves values. Human beings believe in something. Can AI also accept that? Can AI also believe in those things? We are feeding a lot of data into AI, and AI can learn some basic logics and some basic concepts. I'm no expert in AI, but just as an ordinary writer, I feel that it's like old intelligence is training new intelligence, just like human parents are interacting with the newly born infants. You are trying to teach the infant the information of the world and what information should be accepted and what should be refuted or rejected. So this actually involves values. So I think in the future, the relationship between man and AI is actually ethical. This is about the ethical issues between two intelligent beings, how to build mutual trust. If you ask AI to learn sci-fi movies, if you feed a lot of sci-fi movies to AI, maybe AI will learn a lot of relationship and information, because in such movies, there is a lot of information and relationship. For example, Wandering Earth. In Wandering Earth, AI will make rational decisions. For example, this plan has failed, so we need to abandon all people on Earth, and we need to choose plan B. But the protagonist destroyed the moss using the Russian liquor, and then executed a different plan, that is to fight for his own homeland. And in the end, everybody does not want to abandon their partners, their friends. So how would AI understand this? So this would be very interesting. It's an ethical question. Okay, thank you very much, Fei Dao. So obviously naming would be very useful. When I name you, you have so many good points. And also, I have some thoughts to share with you. So is the planet, is Earth flat or round? So a lot of 5-year-old or 6-year-old would ask me this question frequently. They would say that, well, Earth is flat, it's not circular, it's not round, it's not spherical. So maybe you can tell me how to answer this question. For example, we can show them some evidence that planet Earth is spherical, evidence that children can understand, evidence that a 5-year-old or 6-year-old can understand. So this is a very interesting question. And another question is, Fei Dao mentioned something that is very interesting. So today, if big data and AI can develop the COVID vaccine, you know, they can develop this new vaccine based on research around the world. Do you accept the vaccine? Will you think that which vaccine is more reliable, the vaccine developed by AI or vaccine developed by human beings? Which would be your choice? And the day before yesterday, I participated in a panel, and the panelists were discussing that AI was so powerful, but still, we would only trust human beings to press upon the button for nuclear weapons. So that's very interesting. Human beings have already witnessed so many crazy leaders or presidents. I will not name them exactly. We have seen so many crazy leaders, but why do we still trust human leaders? Why don't we trust AI more? So if we just ask AI to to make the decision, then will there be more disasters or less disasters? Is AI more rational than us, or will AI hate us and destroy us? So this is very controversial. We can also discuss about that. Next question for Chen Qiufan. I mentioned this live joint stock company, and some comments said that it's super interesting. Indeed, it's a very interesting and creative idea. And also this live algorithm idea, you can go back and you can calculate your choices. This is very interesting. So algorithm for your destiny, this is something very interesting. So in your opinion, what's your view for AI and strong AI? And in the future, if AI can tell you where your destiny is headed towards, and just like the navigation system can tell you which path is the shortest, will you trust AI's decision? Will you trust AI's direction? Okay, thank you, Jingfang. Actually, just now, Fei Dao was talking about the two intelligence interacting with each other. This brings us back to the original definition of science fiction. And Frankenstein was just about the story. So if science and technologies can create a new creature or new being, which has never existed before in the world, then this being is totally different from mankind. And what's the relationship between this being and its creator? It's very interesting. That is how to coexist with otherness. So the others, the imagination of the others, and the interplay between the two will be very interesting. And we are exploring and we are discussing this issue. It involves so many different complicated factors. For example, mankind, for our own awareness and intelligence, how does our awareness function in terms of biology or chemistry? Is it limited? Is it finite or infinite? Or is it collaborated effects among our brain neurons? So we are still discussing this. So human beings only have a superficial understanding of ourselves. So now AI is mostly learning and simulating how human beings understand, perceive the world, and make decisions, including deep learning and multi-layered neuron network. So I think on that basis, AI, if AI can only simulate or imitate, then it's even more superficial. So I don't think that AI will become strong AI or ultra AI that will go beyond human intelligence. But from a totally different perspective, if we redesign AI, of course, I'm no expert, and there are different theories about AI and machine learning. They would put forward their own development paths. If one day there is strong AI, then surely it will be totally different from human intelligence. It will be different from how we perceive the world, understand the world, and make decisions. I remember that the Nobel physical winner, Roger Penrose, argued that the awareness of human beings cannot be calculated. Of course, this is only a postulation. It is still being debated. But intuitively speaking, he's a mathematician. So from a very abstract perspective, he thinks that a human being's awareness is not purely algorithm. It also touches upon our understanding of the physical world. So maybe in the future, step by step, we need to get rid of egocentrism. And you know, in our history of science, from Earth center to sun-centered theory, and from the creation by God to evolution theory, we are gradually getting rid of egocentrism. And in the era of AI, also step by step, AI will develop in the direction of decentralization. And what will be the result of such a process? That is worthy of more discussion. And Dai Jinhua said that when we talk about the others, the ultimate purpose is for us to understand that we are the others. We are members of the others. So this is cross different intelligence, or this empathy and mutual understanding between different intelligence. And in my own work, I will talk about, you know, the awareness of a human being will be integrated into the deep ocean and into a worm in the ocean. but the worm does not have other perceptive functions. It can only touch things. So by touching, the worm will reconstruct his or her perception of time and space. So it touches upon a fundamental paradigm shift. And Jingfang mentioned our understanding of destiny or our understanding of history, whether it's linear or non-linear, or it's cyclical or progressive. Actually, it is still based on the human beings' dimension of a temporal dimension. And it's not about cause and effect. It's not causality. Causality is not the driving force. Actually, interconnectivity is the driving force. So human beings can process information in their brain, and AI can better understand what is destiny, because they can process data on a much larger magnitude. And in my novel Life Algorithm, you can go back to the past and alter certain critical moments in your life to change your current destiny. But in the end, you will find that all those changes will be in vain. And also, Fei Dao mentioned that we are doing this joint writing projects based on the collaboration between human writers and AI writers. So when you enter a sentence, the AI will give you several choices, because the machine, based on the understanding of the prior information, will give you several different directions or different plots. And based on the different directions, the end will be an open-ended one. The result of your novel will be open-ended. So maybe you'll be anxious. How can I reach the final ending if I do it like that? So maybe you think that, how can I just stop the machine from further dividing the story into a different number of possible scenarios? I want to have a finite end. So this would give us a lot of inspirations. So human beings and AI, we really need to leverage the agency of human beings to interact with the AI. And through such dialogue, it will inspire more imagination and reflection on our part. So AI is like a mirror. We can see our own reflection in AI. So in the reflection of the others, we can discuss more in-depth problems and issues, not from egocentrism perspective, because if we put ourselves at the center, we won't be able to see those issues. So I think probably this is the most inspirative perspective provided by AI. So that's all, thank you. Okay, thank you, Chen. And Xiajia, do you have anything to share with us? So in the future, if we have this omnipotent AI or strong AI, will this era come? And also in your work, you mainly regard them as an instrument or as an anthropomorphized being. So for now, I just want to solicit your views on AI. Thank you very much, Jingfang. Well, in this semester, I was teaching a class on AI. And in these 2 weeks, I was talking about the man-made man. So I want to share with you my reflections in this class. From a literary and cultural perspective, how to understand the writing of this topic by human beings, from Frankenstein to Asimov's robot, and then to Andrew, the simulated robots, and then to Cyborg, the half machine, half human being. And then we have AI, which does not have a substantiated body. It's just thinking. It's just a conceptual idea. So what is changing in this process? And what keeps unchanged? I think most importantly, back to the 1920s, Capek wrote RUR. So in this work, there was a very important piece of information. You know, it was about drama. A company made a lot of machine labor, mechanical labor. And when I was reading the texts, there was one interesting conversation. I just want to copy and paste this conversation into the chat box. So this is the Chinese version, and then I will paste the English version. So the core issue is when we regard human beings as labor. So wait a moment. So the core issue is in capitalism, in the capitalism system, what's the significance of the existence of man? When are you needed? When you are regarded as labor, then what abilities are needed by this capitalist system in large quantities? And what abilities are not so much needed by the system? So in this conversation, Capek mentioned that they need physical labor production rather than playing piano or appreciating music. So these robots will have intelligence, but they don't have soul. So how do you understand soul in this context? Well, as far as the author is concerned, soul. So when man is not regarded as labor, when man cannot be sold or bought in the capitalist society, then they have soul. So the Asimov's idea of a robot, they have this iron shell. They don't need to resemble human beings. Such robots are in this industrial production background, the material labor. So our expectation for human beings is just they can just repeat their manual labor in the production line. But today, when we talk about AI, we are entering this post-industrial era. So in this era, what is needed by the era is immaterial labor, including emotional labor. For example, emotional accompanying and the ability of communication and understanding. And also playing piano is highly needed. And also to be able to play chess and play and tell story to children and accompany old people. These abilities will be valued in this era. So two interesting texts about two movies. One is in 2012, about a virtual Hollywood actress. She only has an image. She does not have a substantiated body, and she was very popular. Another example is Her. You have all watched this movie. It's a virtual speech-making assistant. So both images are female, and the male protagonists, the two male protagonists are doing immaterial labor. One is a outdated cinema director, film director. The other is also doing emotional-based, feeling-based work. So you would feel that the protagonists are very anxious, and because they need to sell their labor to make a living. So they would be very anxious. They would be anxious, you know, whether my abilities cannot be replaced by AI. So if we are still expecting human beings to provide certain abilities in a capitalist society, instead of all its abilities. Because some abilities are very sellable, they can sell a lot, but some abilities cannot be sold. No people want to buy these abilities. So if we build a virtual robot, we don't want this robot to have that part of abilities. We only want this robot to have this part of abilities, especially the abilities that are most profitable. So we would feel that we are threatened by certain man-made being. So the strong AI, can strong AI resemble human beings in all aspects? I think that's not important. I think what's important is that strong AI does not need to resemble human being, but in many aspects, it is proving that human beings are useless to the production system. For example, I can prove that I can appreciate literature. I have a noble mind. I can appreciate beauty. I have this soul, but my soul is useless to the system. And so as a human being, compared with a certain artificial intelligence, which is only specialized in one certain aspect of expertise, I'm no superior than to that. So maybe I will be phased out one day in the future. So in the questions, one question for Wu Yan and Sanfeng, the two presentations mention robot and AI science fiction in two periods of time in China's history. I read their presentations, I read their slides, and one question is, in these two periods of time, what has changed? So I think one prominent change is that in 1980s, in the beginning of reform and opening up, most sci-fi fictions are writing about robots. So robots were regarded, they are very rational, they have high intelligence, they don't have emotions. But on the other hand, we have a natural person. They are confronting each other. And then in this confrontation, the emotion and desire of human beings are regarded as nature, and nature will defeat technology. Nature will be superior to technology. So that's a common thing for these novels. But ever after 1990s till now, there has been a rapid transformation, very unbalanced development for China. China progresses from industrial production to post-industrial production. So from 1990s to now, most sci-fi works, they have focused more on AI from robots, and also a lot of AI, in the stories of AI, you will see that the emotions, desires, appreciation of human beings can be, they can be replaced or somehow assimilated by technologies. They are not really superior to technologies. So when AI is competing with AI, they can be very sexy. They can arouse your desire, just like Chen Qiufan's novels, for example. In this context, in this environment of AI, many human desires can be produced in this environment. So this is Chinese characteristics, because in the United States, in the US culture, in the US context, maybe it needs 100 years, but in China, just within a very short period of time, you can see that the characteristics and the genres of writing and also the processing of details in the works will undergo tremendous changes. And also there will be conflicts among different styles of writing. So when we talk about Chinese sci-fi, I can share with you some of my observations and ideas. Okay, that's just my ideas. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Xiajia. Actually, the previous speakers have also shared with us good ideas. But we only have limited time today, and we still need to go back to another question about the sci-fi creation, and many Western audience will be very interested. That is, after reform and opening up in China, so sci-fi works after 1990s, compared with the West, what are the unique characteristics of the Chinese sci-fi? Are there anything different? Or are there any prominent Chinese characteristics? You know, many international readers and researchers of sci-fi are very interested in this question. Yesterday in the Netherlands embassy, we also talked about the difference and comparison between Chinese and Western sci-fi works in the Netherlands embassy. So Xiajia and Fei Dao, maybe you have more experience, you have summarized the differences and common ground. You can go first, and then Chen Qiufan and Bao Shu. Both of you have studied and lived and worked abroad. So I think you will also have a lot of experience of international communication. So from your own perspective, you can also share with us the differences or the commonalities between Chinese and Western sci-fi works. So Xiajia, you can go first, please. So what is your observation? Well, there was this question that is, what makes the Chinese AI, Chinese fiction Chinese? Where is this Chineseness? How do you understand the Chineseness? Well, there is no, well, fundamentally, the differences in China are about the modernization experience of China, which is different from Europe and the United States. So in this modernization process, there will be different perspectives to understand different things. Let me give you a concrete example. Sanfeng during Q&A, so there's a question about AI and the robot. They would not bring so many negative impacts. So I've written a novel called Tong Tong's Summer, translated by Liu Yukun, Ken Liu. And you can find the online version. And so this work is in the Oriental society. We are faced with the aging society in China.
So the story discusses the aging problem in China and also in Eastern Asia. So the AI in that story can provide accompanying service to the elderly in a family. This kind of topic might be found in Western sci-fi. One thing important about this kind of sci-fi is that in China, this kind of story comes from our revolutionary experience. I don't know whether I put it very accurately, but my understanding of this story is about a life of 3 generations in a family. It is a commonly view that the elderly might be a burden for the family because you need to pay for the old age care. One point made in that story is that in the revolutionary experience of China, the vulnerable, the disadvantaged, including the elderly and the children, have the ability to make contribution by turning their disadvantage into advantage. So in this sense, they become a subject in the story. And this is the specific feature of Chinese story. Also in Chinese sci-fi, we have a very unique structure of feeling and emotions. Still, the example just mentioned, my grandparents are a typical example of elderly people in China. Even when they are very old, they are still making contribution to the family or to the society. They don't want to be a burden to the society. So this kind of story, I believe, reflects China's experience in its modernization process of the 21st century. Another question from the audience is that, can AI technology make the society more equal? Would it be possible that AI can help those vulnerable groups? These people, the vulnerable, who have been excluded from the mainstream society, might be helped by AI to be integrated or reintegrated into society again. Still, I will give you an example, maybe if we have more time. Thank you, Xiajia. Now I will give the floor to Fei Dao. The doctoral thesis of Xiajia has been a study on the Chinese sci-fi in this period. And my doctoral thesis has been focusing on the early period sci-fi that can be dated back to about 100 years ago. So at that time, we don't have a lot of AI-themed sci-fi. They are just a sci-fi in general. So in general, Chinese sci-fi, they are different from the Western because they are the latecomer. They are trying to, the writers are trying to learn from their Western counterparts. And in Western sci-fi works, they seldom mention China. They pay no interest in China. But in Chinese sci-fi, they not only mention China, they not only discuss the problems in China, they also talk about the problems in the Western world. And because writers in China are doing by learning from the West, so sometimes they write in a way that is unfamiliar with their Chinese readers, in a way that is more like their Western counterparts. I myself have been influenced by Western writers. His collection of Riot, it's about stories of robots. One of the short stories is about robots being able to create everything whose name starts with the letter N. This sounds absurd to me, but it's still very interesting. It does not necessarily has any connection with the reality. So in my early career, I started to copy that kind of style, but I'm not so skilled, so I didn't produce a lot of successful works. But later I was suggested by some experts that you need to write something Chinese with Chinese characteristics. But still, I think the works by Lime is very interesting. Thank you, Xiajia and Fei Dao, for your sharing. You shared with us your experience during your college time. And both of you mentioned that Chinese sci-fi writers, they have created their own unique style by learning from Western writers. In recent years, there is a large amount of science fictions from Chinese writers. So judging from these recent publications, do you think they are different from their Western counterparts? Do you think there are more similarities than differences or more differences? Just now, Xiajia and Fei Dao, they provided us with academic perspectives. As a producer, as a writer, myself, I think the aesthetics and also the ideas of Chinese sci-fi mainly come from the translation of Japanese and Western sci-fi works. We are much influenced by those works. So we begin our writing by first emulating. But of course, we will add Chinese characters, but the framework, the structure of the stories are quite similar. So at least the genres are quite similar. So they are similar in nature from my perspective. So I'm also reflecting on this kind of Chineseness. I'm thinking about by Chineseness, so are we making it Chinese at the language level or at the aesthetic level, or maybe something more fundamental? So what does it mean? What does Chineseness mean? Are we going to create a Chinese subject, or are we going to use the big framework from the West and add something Chinese in it? Of course, I think this is an open-ended question. I don't think there is a very one-size-fits-all answer to this question. Our panelists here, you have created a lot of very Chinese sci-fi. One story I remember from one of you is about Confucius climbing up to the mountaintop of Tai Mountain and discover that what underneath is an AI world. That's very interesting and very Chinese. And Bao Shu have produced even more Chinese sci-fi stories. You have a lot of good tries. And in He Jingfang's novels, you have also provide many Chinese perspectives and the Chinese aesthetics. Now I was thinking maybe we can turn those classic fables and even these Chinese myth into elements of sci-fis. Several writers have tried to turn this kind of classic Chinese into the features, into elements of their sci-fi works. For example, they might depict a UFO in the shape of a very typical Chinese crafts. But for me, this is more superficial. It's more superficial. It's combining Chinese features with the big Western narratives. What I'm thinking is maybe we can incorporate more Chinese element. So one question proposed by Western scientists is that why didn't science originate from ancient China? Chinese people have a lot of knowledge about the scientific world, but we didn't develop it into the system of science. Chinese people have a different outlook of science of knowledge. And maybe we can reflect these differences in our sci-fi work. That would be very interesting. And in terms of the philosophy of China and of the Western world, they are different. And maybe we can reflect these kind of philosophical differences into our sci-fi product, sci-fi works. And in this way, we produce something more Chinese. And in this way, we depict a totally different future than that is depicted by the West. But of course, we are just at the starting point. I think we can try to enrich this topic with our creation. Thank you, Chen Qiufan. You mentioned several works by our panelists and their Chineseness. In Chinese sci-fi, there is a lot of element about Chinese history. And also Xiajia, your work, Chinese Encyclopedia, they are also a reflection of Chinese myth, Chinese stories, Chinese fables. In this kind of works, they have Chinese backgrounds, Chinese characters, and Chinese characteristics. So, Bao Shu, can you talk about the difference between a Chinese AI and Western AI narratives? For example, the Blade Runner, and also the Terminator. These are very typical Western AI narratives. But what about the narrative in AI? So what's unique about Chinese AI narrative? The first point I would like to make is that I don't think it's necessary to find the so-called Chineseness in our creation. It's not a paradigm and it's not a must. Because the identity of the writer may not always be reflected in his or her works. But with that, there are a lot of differences between Chinese AI narratives and their Western counterparts. Since the reform and opening up, Chinese people have been constantly thinking about one question, and that is, who are we? Where are we come from? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Chinese people are thinking about these questions after the fast modernization. Some would say we need to embrace the culture of ocean. Some would say we should embrace the Western culture. Some would say we need to go back to our history to find our future. Chinese people realize that in this modernization process, we might still keep this unique identity that is different from the West. So their seek of their identity and the modernization process might be in conflict with each other, but they are the two sides of the same coin. And that kind of struggle is reflected in the sci-fi works during that period of time. Since the 1980s, more and more people, more and more writers try to combine sci-fi topic with Chinese histories. This might be interesting. On the one hand, we want to find our roots, find our history, but on the other hand, we are trying to explain our history with the help of technology. Some of our panelists and the speaker have mentioned the important Chinese classic work, Yan Shi Creates Man. And there are a lot of reproduction of this story in today's sci-fi works in China. They are not just trying to copy that story. They are bringing the spirit of that story into a modern sci-fi. For many Chinese sci-fi writers, they were thinking about the problem that was proposed by Chen Qiufan. That is, why didn't China develop a system of science? And I realized that there are a lot of stories situated in two historical periods. One is in the spring and autumn period, and the second is situated in the Qing or Ming dynasty. So these are two important historical periods which represents the big shift in Chinese history. So that is why a lot of Chinese sci-fi writers want to put their story in that context, because they were reflecting on the history of China. And also the supernova era, written by a Chinese writer, is about the story of the protagonist running into a historian museum and want to find the power of his ancestors. And focusing on AI, this is also a very interesting topic. AI story might not relate to China very closely, but with close investigation, one example is one of my works, Nyonyo. It's about the story of the living and the dead. When I was creating that story, I was not bearing Chineseness in my mind. But still, the story reflected some Chinese thinkings, Chinese mentality. People might be critical about my story, Nyonyo, because in the Chinese mentality, we need to have a child for the family reproduction. So what is the meaning of having an AI as a child? So this kind of critical attitudes towards my story might not be understood by our Western readers. And that reflects the difference between our two cultures. One story from Hoa Jingfang was about the name of the story is Immortal Hospital, about a man going into the hospital, and when he came out of the hospital, he became something like an AI, but something like a human being. And in that story, it reflects a lot of Chinese feelings and emotions. So I recommend you to read that story. So in stories about the relationship between AI and family, actually a lot of cultural influences are embedded in this kind of story, even though we are not paying special attention to the so-called Chineseness. Our background, our culture will have influence on our writings. And about the God, the theme, the God. In Chinese works, the God is not a personality. It's more like something like the rule of the world, the rules of the world. But in Western works, the God is the God. It's a subject, it's a personality. So that's the difference between our attitudes towards religion and towards gods in China and in Western sci-fi. And this is a very good topic for our further exploration. So that's only some food for thoughts. Thank you all for sharing, but we don't have time for detailed discussion. I myself has a lot of questions, and I know there are many questions from the audience. To sum up, I would like to share with you some of my perspectives. I think for a writer, as long as he or she provides her or his understanding of the word in an honest way, in a modest way, it will have its own uniqueness, be it Chinese or Western. For example, if I want to write about family, because I have 2 children, I might put that story in a family with 3 generations, a big family. I would talk about the different understandings of raising children. So what is AI in this story? AI might be a babysitter. Maybe an AI would replace a human babysitter. So this might be the scene in my story because of my cultural background, my family background. Because in a Chinese neighborhood, you might see that a lot of babysitters, they are paid for taking care of the children. So that might become a scene in my story. And the babysitters might be chatting with each other. It's very commonly seen in our daily life. And if we put this in our stories, people will believe in it. They would believe that it's the reality. And if I can depict this kind of scene, very unique Chinese scene in my story, I believe they will become the so-called Chineseness. So as long as you are writing your own feelings, your own experience, and your observations, it will give your works its own uniqueness. So China is different from the West, and the southern part of China is different from the northern part. So as long as you are sharing your own feelings and experiences, I believe your work would be different from that of others. But for human beings, I believe we share common feelings. For example, our fear of death and our love and our empathy. These are the commonalities of works in whatever culture. So we would like to conclude with this discussion of the commonality and differences between AI narratives in China and in the West. I would like to thank the organizer, the Berggruen, and also the Cambridge Center for organizing this fantastic workshop, for providing this platform for our discussion.